He was worth millions. He owned buildings in 4 countries. He flew first class before most people even woke up. But on a quiet Tuesday morning in a small cafe in Bruges, a waitress said 7 words that destroyed him completely. And those 7 words were ones his own mother had kept secret for years. If you've ever chosen work over someone you love, this story is going to hit differently. Stay with me. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe right now, because we tell the ones that actually change how you see your life. The smell hit him first. Not the sharp, sterile air of his London office, or the recycled coolness of a private jet cabin. This was something older. Ground coffee, warm bread, and the kind of quiet that only exists in places that have never tried to impress anyone. Lucien Voss stepped inside the small cafe on the cobblestone corner of Bruges and felt immediately out of place. His coat alone cost more than the furniture. But his mother, Elise, had chosen this place. And today, for once, he had said yes without arguing. She was already seated when he arrived, her hands wrapped around a ceramic cup, her silver hair catching the pale autumn light coming through the window. She looked smaller than he remembered. Softer. The kind of fragile that creeps up on people you don't see often enough. He kissed her cheek and sat across from her, loosening his collar slightly, trying to settle into a world that moved slower than his own. They spoke carefully at first. The way people do when too much time has passed, and neither wants to be the one to mention it. He asked about her health. She asked about his work. Both answers were shorter than the truth. But then Elise smiled, that warm, unguarded smile she had given him his whole life. And for just a moment, Lucien felt like a boy again. Small, quiet, needing nothing more than this. He was about to speak, to say something real, perhaps for the first time in months. But then her eyes moved, past his shoulder, toward the far end of the cafe, and whatever warmth had been sitting in her expression shifted. Her lips parted slightly, her fingers tightened around the cup, and her eyes, those calm, steady eyes he had known his entire life, filled slowly with tears. He turned around. A young woman was walking toward their table, carrying a tray with unhurried, quiet steps. She wore a simple dark apron. Her expression was polite, professional. She looked like someone who had learned long ago how to be invisible in a room. She placed the coffee down gently without a word. And that was when Elise stood up. Slowly, despite her knees. Despite her age. Despite everything. Her voice came out barely above a whisper, trembling, careful, like she was handling something precious. "Son," she said, her eyes never leaving the young woman's face. "This is the woman who stayed, when you didn't." The cafe kept moving around them. Cups clinked. Someone laughed near the door. But at that small corner table in Bruges, the world had stopped completely. And Lucien Voss, the man who had never lost a negotiation in his life, had absolutely nothing to say. Her name was Hannah Beckett. She hadn't worked at the cafe long. Before this, she had spent nearly 2 years at a small private care home just outside the old city walls, on a quiet street where the canal reflected lamplight every evening. That was where she had met Elise. That was where everything that mattered had happened. Lucien didn't know any of this. He had chosen the care home himself, quickly, between meetings, on a Thursday afternoon when 3 other things demanded his attention. He had selected it the way he selected hotels. By rating. By reputation. By how little he would have to think about it afterward. He sent money every month without missing once. He told himself that was enough. That providing was the same as being present. That love could be measured in direct transfers and quarterly visits he always meant to make longer. But now, standing in a cafe in Bruges, watching his elderly mother hold the hand of a waitress like she was holding onto something sacred, Lucien began to understand, quietly and terribly, that he had been wrong. "There were nights," Hannah began softly, her voice careful, glancing once at Elise before continuing, "when she would be strong all day, cheerful even. She would help other residents, tell stories, make people laugh. But after the lights dimmed and the hallways went quiet, she paused. She would cry. Not from pain. Not from illness." Lucien's jaw tightened. "She cried because she thought she had somehow failed you." The word landed like something heavy dropped from a great height. "Failed me?" he repeated, his voice barely working. Hannah nodded slowly, her eyes steady but gentle. "She used to say, maybe I didn't raise him right. Maybe I taught him to chase things instead of people. Maybe that's my fault." The noise of the cafe faded completely in his ears. His mother, the woman who had worked double shifts to keep him in school, who had folded his shirts the morning of every important day in his life, who had never once asked him for anything, had spent her nights in a care home believing she was the reason he stayed away. He turned to look at her. Elise was watching him with an expression he had no word for. Not anger, not accusation, just love, enormous, patient, slightly heartbroken love. And then came the part that truly undid him. Every evening, Hannah continued, her voice dropping lower now, around 7 o'clock, she would sit near the window in the common room. When the phone rang at the front desk, she would look up. Every single time. Lucian said nothing. And when it wasn't you, which was most evenings, she would just nod quietly and say. Hannah paused, pressing her lips together. She would say, he's very busy. He works so hard. I'm proud of him. The sentence cracked something open inside his chest that had been sealed for years. She had protected him. While sitting alone in a room he had never visited at night, waiting for a call he had never made, she had protected his image to strangers. She had worn his absence like it was something to be proud of. He lowered his head. The polished, powerful man who had never shown weakness in a boardroom sat in a small Belgian cafe and felt the full, quiet weight of everything he had missed. Not in a dramatic way. Not loudly. Just the slow, certain collapse of a version of himself he could no longer defend. What else? He asked finally, his voice barely his own. What else did she hide from me? Hannah looked at Elise once more. And the look that passed between them told him the answer was not small. The cafe had grown quieter around them. Or perhaps Lucian had simply stopped hearing it. He sat with his hands flat on the table, no longer the man who had walked in an hour ago. That man had carried certainty like a second coat. This one carried something heavier, and far more honest. Hannah took a slow breath. She told him about the winter nights when the heating in the care home struggled and Elise refused to complain, not wanting to be a burden to anyone. She told him about the afternoon Elise had a dizzy spell and Hannah had sat with her on the floor of the corridor for 40 minutes, holding her hand, singing softly, an old French lullaby Elise had mentioned once in passing that she used to sing to Lucian as a baby. She taught it to me, Hannah said quietly, so I could sing it back to her when she couldn't sleep. Lucian closed his eyes. Somewhere in London, in a glass-walled office above the city, there were people waiting for his decisions. Contracts pending. Calls unreturned. A life running at full speed in a direction that had slowly, silently, led him away from everything that made speed worth anything at all. He opened his eyes and looked at Hannah properly. Not as a waitress. Not as a stranger. But as someone who had stepped into the space he had left empty and filled it with something he could not buy, could not delegate, and could not recover through an apology alone. Why did you leave the care home? He asked gently. Hannah's expression shifted slightly. My father got sick, she said simply. I needed to be closer to home. And the cafe offered more hours. More hours, he repeated slowly, letting that settle. She was working double shifts, early mornings, late evenings. Not for ambition, not for a career she dreamed of, but to cover her father's medical costs. She had spent 2 years giving his mother what she needed, and was now quietly carrying her own family's pain without asking anyone for help. Without complaint. Without fanfare. Lucian thought about the speeches he had given at business dinners about resilience and dedication. He thought about the framed quotes on his office wall about strength and character. And he looked at this young woman in a cafe apron and understood, with a humility that surprised him, that she had more of both than he had ever truly demonstrated. You cared for my mother like she was your own family, he said, his voice steadier now, but softer than it had ever been in any room. Let me help your father. Not as charity, not as a transaction, but as one human being thanking another for an act of kindness that I will never be able to fully repay. Hannah shook her head slightly, pride and exhaustion, and need all moving across her face at once. She wasn't used to being seen. Years of quiet service had taught her to exist at the edges of other people's important moments. But Elise reached across and took her hand. And that small gesture, that simple, wordless act, broke through every wall Hannah had built around her own vulnerability. She nodded. Once. Barely. And somehow that was everything. Lucian turned to his mother then. Fully. The way he hadn't turned toward anything in years. Without a phone in his hand. Without a next thing waiting, without half his mind already somewhere else. I want you home, he said. Not in a facility. Not somewhere comfortable and managed and far away. I want you in my home. With me. At the table. In the mornings. Elise looked at him for a long moment. Hope and doubt moving through her eyes like weather. She had learned, in her years of waiting, not to reach for beautiful things too quickly. "Lucian," she said softly. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. "That's not why I'm saying it." She searched his face, looking for the old Lucian, the one who made promises between meetings and canceled plans with kind excuses. But what she found instead was something quieter. Something that looked, for the first time in a very long time, like her son. She reached up and touched his face with one thin hand. And she didn't say anything at all, because some moments are too full for words to do anything useful. 3 months passed. The countryside house outside Ghent had always been beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful. Impressive, immaculate, and somehow empty. But now it breathed differently. Elise's room was on the ground floor, facing the garden, where the light came in long and golden every morning. Lucian had chosen that room himself, not from a property listing, but by walking through the house slowly one Sunday afternoon, standing in each doorway, asking himself which room would make her feel most like she belonged. He had never done anything that slowly or that carefully in years. Every morning before his first call, he sat with her. Tea. No agenda. No laptop open on the table. Just two people recovering the language of each other's company. Learning again how to simply be in a room together without performance or purpose. She told him stories he had never heard. About his father, who had died when Lucian was 7 and whom she had never stopped missing. About her own childhood in a small town near Lyon, where her mother had kept a garden and believed that growing things was the closest a person could get to prayer. About the dreams she had carried quietly for decades, never mentioning them because there had always been something more urgent demanding the air in the room. Lucian listened, truly listened, in the way that costs something, in the way that requires you to put yourself down completely and just receive another person. And in those mornings, something healed in him that no amount of professional success had ever touched. Hannah visited on weekends, not as someone who had been helped, and not as someone who owed anything, but as a person who had somehow, unexpectedly, become part of the story of this family. She would bring pastries from the market in Ghent, and Elise would already be at the kitchen table waiting, and the three of them would sit together in the kind of easy warmth that takes years to build between people who actually share something real. Her father's treatment was going well. He had met Lucian once, briefly, and had shaken his hand with both of his and said nothing, because gratitude that deep doesn't always need a sentence. Hannah had started studying again in the evenings, something she had put aside years ago when life got expensive and complicated. Lucian had said nothing about it, asked for nothing in return. He had simply made it possible and then stepped back because he was learning slowly that the most meaningful things you do for people are the ones that give them back to themselves. His business continued. Of course it did. Lucian Voss was still the man who owned buildings in 4 countries and flew first class and made decisions that moved money across borders before breakfast. But something had shifted in the architecture of his days. He stopped taking calls during dinner. He started declining meetings that could have been emails, not because he had lost his edge, but because he had finally found something sharper than ambition, the knowledge of what actually deserves your time. He noticed, quietly, that the problems which had once felt enormous, delayed contracts, difficult partners, market fluctuations, now sat at a different size inside him. Not because they mattered less, but because other things had finally risen to their proper height beside them. He caught himself, one evening, watching his mother fall asleep in the chair by the garden window, the last light resting on her face, and he felt something he hadn't felt in so long he had almost forgotten it had a name. Peace. Not the peace of a finished deal. Not the brief, restless satisfaction of a goal achieved, but the deep, still peace of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be, doing exactly what he is supposed to be doing, for exactly the right reasons. He had signed 1,000 contracts in his life. Deals worth millions. Agreements that had built his empire line by line, signature by signature, across 2 decades of relentless work. But the most important promise he ever made was never written down. It was made on a quiet Tuesday morning, in a small cafe on a cobblestone corner in Bruges, over a cup of coffee that had gone cold while 3 lives slowly changed direction. No lawyers present. No witnesses required. Just a son, finally choosing to show up. And a mother, who had never stopped believing that one day, in her quiet, patient, unshakable way, he would. Some debts cannot be paid with money, but they can still be paid. One morning at a time. One cup of tea. One story you've never heard before. One ordinary day you choose, finally, to be fully present for. That is the only currency that never loses its value. And it was always, always free. And so the story ends. Not with a grand gesture. Not with a headline, or an award, or a moment the world would ever photograph or celebrate. It ends with a man sitting beside a garden window, watching morning light fall on his mother's face, holding a cup of tea that had gone slightly cold because he was too busy being present to notice. That's it. That's the whole victory. Lucian Voss, the man who had negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions, who had sat across from some of the most powerful people in Europe, who had built an empire with nothing but will and relentless ambition, had finally made the most important decision of his life. And it didn't require a boardroom. It didn't require a strategy. It just required him to stop, to turn around, and to choose the people who had been quietly waiting, with impossible patience and impossible love, for him to find his way back. Hannah never asked for recognition. She had simply done what kind people do. She showed up in the dark for someone who needed a hand to hold. And in doing so, she had unknowingly set into motion a chain of events that changed 3 lives completely. That is what kindness does. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't keep score. It doesn't wait to be thanked or noticed or rewarded. It just quietly holds the door open, for as long as it takes, trusting that eventually the right person will walk through. Elise had known that her whole life. She had lived it, breathed it, raised a son on it, even when that son forgot. And Hannah had carried it forward, in a care home on a quiet Belgian street, on the nights when no one important was watching. And Lucian, brilliant, driven, complicated Lucian, had finally learned it. Not from a book, not from a mentor, not from any of the 1,000 lessons his success had tried to teach him, but from a cup of coffee, and a stranger, and a mother who never stopped believing in the boy she raised, even when the man he became forgot to come home. Some people spend their whole lives building things that impress the world. And some people spend their whole lives building something quieter, something warmer, something that waits for you by the window every evening, something that says, without words, without conditions, without end, I'm still here. Come home. The question this story leaves with you is simple. And it is this: who is waiting by your window right now? And what are you waiting for? If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone, if it made you reach for your phone, if it made you feel something you needed to feel today, then share it. Not for us, but for the person in your life who needs to hear it. Subscribe, hit the bell, and come back, because we will never stop telling the stories that remind you what truly matters. Take care of the people you love, while you still can.